welcome back, everybody. Thanks for sticking with us. Dave Didayak's our guest. Dave spent 40 years at the Observer-Dispatch, just retired, and 47 years total in journalism. We're talking about his career. One of the best things, I think, Dave, that you ever wrote, one of your best columns, was your last one, where you talked about your career. Was that a tough column to write?
Yeah, it was. I probably worked on that column for, I don't know, probably a month, tweaking it here and there, making sure I hit the points that I wanted to hit, and I probably didn't hit everything that I should have. But it was tough. It was long, and I warned them that it was going to be long, and they said, "Fine, do whatever." You know.
How many words was it?
The last space I had. So
how many words was it, Dave?
I don't even remember how many. It must have been a couple thousand words.
It didn't seem that long to read it. One of the things you did, one of the roads you traveled with that column, I'm not sure I'd have gone down that road, but you did, naming names, people that you worked with over the years. When you got all done and it was published, did you say, "Oh boy, I should have mentioned this one, I should have mentioned that one"?
Yeah, I thought about that, and that was part of the tweaking. As I went through, I realized there was someone I should have mentioned, and I went back and I added some stuff, and I'm sure there's some people in there. You know, one of the things about the community is that we really are a community of great people, and I was fortunate enough to be in the job that I had. Because in writing a column, as you know, Joe, and we sat side by side for at least a dozen years, writing columns, and there was always enough people to go around for both of us, and we both wrote about some really great people in this town, and probably only scratched the surface, and I met so many people, and even today people will come up to me, and you know, sadly, as you know. You don't remember everybody. They remember you because your face is in the paper every day, and there you are, and you did something special for them by highlighting them in the paper, and a lot of them you do remember because you know many of them stick out. Like I think in that column I mentioned one person in particular who always stuck out in my memory was Julian Noga. I had done a column on Julian. Who had been a prisoner of war in a concentration camp because he was a Polish man who made the mistake of falling in love with an Austrian woman, and in Germany he didn't do that, and he got thrown into a concentration camp for that, and in any case he told such a fascinating story about his close encounter with Adolf Eichmann, and how he almost got shipped off to Auschwitz, and how he was saved by a guard that he had befriended with cigarettes, and told to go back to his barracks when everybody else was assembling on the field, and the big car pulled up, and out stepped this Gestapo agent, and it turned out it was Adolf Eichmann, and he just went down the line and arbitrarily singled out people to send to Auschwitz, and I most of the time I always took notes, as you know, and sometimes you take more notes than others, but when I interviewed Julian, I didn't take one note because his story was so riveting that I couldn't write, and I'm sure you probably ran into things like situations like that, but I couldn't write at the moment because his story was just such an amazing story, and I went back to the office and walked around the office for about a half an hour trying to think of, you know, how am I going to put this into words, and I finally did, and he was just an amazing man, and he remembered things like that.
Yeah, and he went on to be on WIBX for many years.
Oh yeah, I think he had the longest running Polish show in the country.
Yeah. And another one that you wrote about in your last column, and you wrote about him very nicely over the years, was Walter D. Edmonds, Boonville's own Walter D. Edmonds.
Yeah, you know, it's funny about Walter Edmonds. I had regretted for many years never going to visit him or trying to make contact with him when he was living in Hawkinsville. And so it was 1987, I believe it is. My family and I were going to take a trip to Boston. And he was living in Concord at the time. He had moved to Concord after he sold his Northlands up in Hawkinsville. And he was living in Concord. And I said to my wife, I said, you know, I'm going to call him and ask if we could stop by. And she said, well, you can't do that. And I said, well, sure I can. What's he going to say? He's going to say, well, the worst he could say is, I'm sorry, no, you can't, you know, no. And so I did. I called him, and I asked him, I told him, you know, who I was, and he was just the most gracious guy you'd ever want to meet. And he said, oh yeah, by all means, stop by. He says, well, we're going to a Boston Pops concert that night, because this was, I think it was a Saturday we were going to get there, or a Sunday. And he said, but you could stop by and say hello. And he gave me his address, and we stopped by. So when we pulled up in front of his house, I got out and I told my wife, and our girls were little at the time. They were like 7 and 5 or something along that line. And I said, you guys stay in the car. I'm just going to go. I had my copy of Drums Along the Mohawk, and I wanted him to sign it. And I said, I'm just going to have him sign the book. I'm going to say hello, and we'll be on our way. So I went up. I knocked on the door. He opens the door, and he brushed right by me. And he looked up and down the street. He says, well, where's your family? And I said, well, they're in the car. I said, you know, the girls are little. They've had a long ride, and I don't want them to, you know, tear your house down. And bring them in, bring them in. So anyway, long story short, we ended up spending about 2 hours with probably the most prolific upstate New York writer that there was. And just a gracious man. Yeah. And we maintained contact until the day he died. He would write letters, and we'd write right back and forth. And, yeah. And then he came to Utica College. Dr. Frank Bergman, who was one of my English professors at Utica College, who became the Walter D. Edmonds Scholar at Utica College. And he was instrumental in getting Walter Edmonds to leave his papers to the college after his death. And something I don't think Harvard was too excited about, because Edmonds was a graduate of Harvard, and he left his papers to Utica College.
Let me jump in right here, Dave,
sure,
because we're going to take a break, but we'll be back. We'll finish your thought. Short break, right back. Dave Didyk's our guest.